I was halfway through pouring the foundation for my new workshop when a silver Lexus SUV screeched to a halt on the dirt road beside my property, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on my freshly mixed concrete like powdered sugar on a cake nobody wanted. A woman in her mid-40s emerged from the vehicle, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked like she'd given herself an impromptu facelift. She wore white capri pants that had probably never seen actual work and a floral blouse that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager," from 50 yards away. Her face was already twisted into an expression of righteous indignation as she marched toward me, clipboard in hand like a weapon. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You need to stop this construction immediately." I straightened up from where I'd been smoothing the concrete, wiping my hands on my jeans. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "I'm Deborah Henderson, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association," she announced, as if I should have been expecting her arrival with a red carpet and champagne. "And you are in violation of several HOA regulations." I looked around at my property, 5 acres of beautiful Wyoming land just outside Cheyenne that I'd purchased 6 months ago specifically, because it was far enough from any neighborhood that I wouldn't have to deal with this exact type of situation. The nearest house was a good half-mile away, and that belonged to my buddy Frank, who couldn't care less what I built on my own land. "I think you've got the wrong property," I said, keeping my tone polite. "I'm not part of any HOA." Deborah's eyes narrowed, and she flipped through the papers on her clipboard with aggressive efficiency. "This is 4782 County Road 214, correct?" "That's right." "Then you are within the Meadowbrook Hills community boundaries, and as such, you are subject to our rules and regulations." She thrust a paper toward me. "You failed to submit architectural plans for approval. You did not pay your annual HOA dues, and the structure you're building does not conform to the aesthetic guidelines outlined in Article 7, Section 3 of the HOA Covenant." I took the paper from her, glancing at what appeared to be a hand-drawn map with a highlighted area that supposedly encompassed the HOA jurisdiction. My property was circled in red marker, but the map was crude at best, with no official survey markers or legal descriptions that I could see. "Look, Mrs. Henderson, it's Miss Henderson," she corrected sharply. "Miss Henderson, I did my due diligence before buying this land. I specifically checked with the county recorder's office to make sure there were no HOA restrictions. This property has never been part of any HOA, and I've got the documentation to prove it." Her face flushed pink, creeping up from her collar like a thermometer measuring rising fury. "That's impossible." The Meadowbrook Hills HOA was established in 2019, and our boundaries clearly extend to include this parcel. "Then your boundaries are wrong," I said, handing the paper back to her. "I'm Zachary Barrett, and I own this land free and clear. No HOA, no covenants, no restrictions except standard county building codes, which I'm following to the letter." Deborah's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "This is unacceptable. You cannot simply ignore the HOA because it's inconvenient for you. Everyone in Meadowbrook Hills pays their dues and follows the rules. We maintain property values and community standards." I gestured around at the empty landscape. "What community? The nearest Meadowbrook Hills house is over a mile from here. My property line doesn't even come close to your development." "That's not what our records show," she insisted, jabbing a manicured finger at her clipboard. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the HOA board, and if you don't cease construction immediately, we will pursue legal action." "You do what you need to do," I said, turning back to my work. "But I'm not stopping. This is my property, and I'm building a workshop that I've already got permits for from Laramie County. I heard her make a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a growl, then the sharp click of her heels as she stomped back to her Lexus. The engine roared to life, and she peeled out, leaving another cloud of dust in her wake. My neighbor Frank wandered over about 20 minutes later, a beer in each hand. He was in his 60s, with a weathered face and the kind of permanent squint that came from a lifetime of outdoor work. "Saw you had a visitor," he said, offering me one of the beers. "Let me guess, Deborah Henderson." I accepted the cold bottle gratefully, taking a long drink. "You know her," Frank laughed, a rough bark of amusement. "Everyone within 10 miles knows her. She's been trying to expand the HOA's territory for the past 2 years. Started with the actual Meadowbrook Hills development, which is fine. That's what those folks signed up for. But then she got it in her head that the whole area should be under HOA control. Can she do that? Just claim property that was never part of the HOA? Hell no," Frank said. "But that doesn't stop her from trying. She sent me a letter last year claiming my ranch was in violation of their regulations about livestock. I've got horses, chickens, and 3 dozen cattle. Had this land for 40 years, long before there was any Meadowbrook Hills." I sent her a nice letter back explaining exactly where she could file her complaint. I grinned despite my irritation. "What'd she do?" "Sent the county inspector out here 3 times in 2 months. Every time they found everything in order because I run a legitimate operation. Eventually they told her to stop wasting their time." Frank took a swig of his beer. "She's persistent, though. Be prepared for a fight." "I've got all my paperwork in order," I said. "Deed, title, survey, permits. Everything shows this property has no HOA restrictions." "Good. Keep multiple copies. Deborah's the type to make documents disappear if it suits her purposes." We finished our beers while I wrapped up the concrete work for the day, making sure it was properly level and smooth. The workshop was going to be a beauty when it was finished. A 30 by 40 structure with high ceilings, plenty of natural light, and enough space for all my woodworking equipment. I'd been planning this for years, saving up money while living in a cramped apartment in Denver. When I'd found this property, with its stunning views of the prairie and the mountains in the distance, I knew it was perfect. The last thing I needed was some power-hungry HOA president trying to derail everything. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. It was a cease and desist order, demanding I halt all construction immediately and appear before the HOA board to answer for multiple violations. The letter listed a dozen supposed infractions, from failure to submit architectural plans to improper property maintenance, which was rich considering my land looked better than half the yards I'd seen in their actual development. I called my real estate attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Wu who'd handled the property purchase. She listened to the situation, then asked me to scan and email her all the documents, including the HOA's letter. "Give me a week," she said. "I'll pull the official records and survey maps. If what you're telling me is accurate and I have no reason to doubt you, then the HOA has no legal standing whatsoever. This is harassment, plain and simple." "Can they actually take me to court over this?" "They can try," Patricia said, "but they won't win. The question is whether they're foolish enough to waste everyone's time and money pursuing a case they can't possibly win. Never underestimate the stubbornness of a HOA president with a grudge." Patricia's words echoed in my head when, 4 days later, I returned to my property to find a group of people standing in front of my partially constructed workshop. There were 5 of them, all middle-aged or older, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Leading the pack was Deborah Henderson, dressed in another inappropriate outfit for a construction site, this time a beige pantsuit with heels that kept sinking into the soft earth. "Mr. Barrett," she called out as I got out of my truck, "we need to have a conversation." I approached slowly, taking in the scene. Behind the group, I noticed someone had placed orange traffic cones around my workshop foundation, the kind you'd see at a legitimate construction site that was shut down for violations. "Who put those cones there?" I asked. "I did," Deborah said. "As HOA president, I have the authority to halt construction that violates our community standards." "No, you don't," I said flatly. "This isn't your property and you're trespassing. I'm going to need all of you to leave." One of the men in the group, a heavy-set guy with a red face and thinning hair, stepped forward. "Now hold on, let's all be reasonable here. I'm Tom Mitchell, HOA Vice President. We're not trying to cause trouble. We just want to ensure that all construction in our community maintains the standards we've worked hard to establish." "Your community is over there," I said, pointing toward the Meadowbrook Hills development in the distance. "This is my property, separate and distinct from your HOA. I have legal documentation proving it." "Your so-called documentation is flawed," Deborah interjected. "Our HOA boundaries were properly filed with the county, and they include this parcel." "Then your filing is fraudulent," I said, my patience wearing thin. "Because the county recorder's office has no record of this property ever being part of any HOA. I've checked multiple times." Deborah's face went through several interesting color changes. "Are you accusing me of fraud?" "I'm saying someone made a mistake," I said, trying to dial it back a notch. "Maybe the boundaries were drawn incorrectly, or maybe there was a clerical error. But the fact remains, this property isn't part of your HOA and never has been." A woman with silver hair and kind eyes spoke up. "I'm Margaret Dunn, HOA Treasurer. May I ask when you purchased this property?" 6 months ago, January of this year, and the previous owner was an elderly man named Robert Callahan who'd owned it since 1987. He passed away and his estate sold it to me. Margaret exchanged glances with the other board members. "Robert Callahan, I remember him. He used to come to the farmers' market in town." "He was never part of your HOA," I said. "And neither am I." Tom Mitchell cleared his throat. "Look, even if there's some dispute about the boundaries, surely we can come to an agreement. Join the HOA voluntarily. The annual dues are only $600, and it would help maintain property values for everyone in the area." "I don't want to be part of an HOA," I said. "That's why I bought property that wasn't in one. I want to build my workshop, live my life, and not have to ask permission every time I want to paint my fence or plant a tree." "That's a very selfish attitude," Deborah snapped. "HOAs exist to protect everyone's investment. And I respect that, for people who choose to buy in an HOA community." I didn't. The standoff continued for another 10 minutes, with Deborah becoming increasingly agitated and the other board members looking progressively more uncomfortable. Finally, Margaret suggested they table the discussion and schedule a formal mediation session. I agreed to that, figuring it would buy me time for Patricia to complete her research. After they left, taking their ridiculous traffic cones with them, I called Patricia and updated her on the situation. "They actually came to your property?" she asked, sounding amazed. "That's trespassing. You could file a police report." "I don't want to escalate things if I don't have to," I said, "but I also can't have them showing up whenever they want and trying to shut down my construction." "I've got good news," Patricia said. "I pulled all the relevant records. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA filing from 2019 very specifically describes their boundaries, and your property is not included, not even close. The nearest boundary line is approximately 800 feet from your property line. There's a county road and 3 other parcels in between. Relief washed over me. So I'm definitely in the clear. Absolutely. I'm preparing a formal letter to the HOA board with copies of all relevant documentation. I'll also include a cease and desist notice regarding their harassment and trespassing. If they continue, we can pursue legal action against them. How long before you can get that sent? I'll have it ready tomorrow. I'll send it certified mail so there's no question they received it. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Deborah Henderson wasn't going to back down just because a lawyer sent her a letter. She had the look of someone who'd never been told no in her life and didn't plan to start accepting it now. I was right. Construction continued over the next week without incident. The workshop's frame went up quickly, and I was pleased with how it was taking shape. Frank stopped by regularly, ostensibly to check on my progress, but really just to have someone to talk to. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier, and I got the sense he was lonely out on his ranch. "You hear about the HOA meeting?" he asked one afternoon, sitting on a stack of lumber while I measured for the roof trusses. "What meeting?" "Emergency session last night. Someone I know who lives in Meadowbrook Hills told me about it. Apparently Deborah is rallying the troops, claiming you're building some kind of commercial operation that's going to destroy their property values." I set down my tape measure. "A commercial operation?" "It's a personal workshop for woodworking." "I know that, and you know that, but she's spinning a story about how you're going to turn it into a manufacturing plant or something. Got about 30 homeowners all worked up." "Let me guess. She didn't mention that my property isn't actually in their HOA. Not according to my source. She's presenting it like you're a homeowner in violation, not someone completely outside their jurisdiction." I felt anger bubbling up. That's defamation. "She's lying to her own community." Frank shrugged. "That's Deborah. She believes her own version of reality, and she's convincing enough that people follow along." Patricia's letter arrived at the HOA board's registered address 2 days later. I got a copy via email, and it was a thing of beauty. 4 pages of legal language that boiled down to leave my client alone or face the consequences, backed up by county records, survey maps, and property deeds that made it crystal clear my land was not, had never been, and would never be part of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. I expected a response. What I didn't expect was Deborah Henderson showing up at my property at 7 in the morning with a news crew. I was having my first coffee of the day, standing on the porch of the small cabin I'd been living in while building the workshop, when I heard vehicles approaching. 2 trucks, one with a satellite dish mounted on top and a logo for a Cheyenne news station on the side. Deborah emerged from her Lexus wearing a navy suit and enough makeup for a television appearance, which apparently was exactly what she had planned. A reporter and cameraman approached with her, and I realized with mounting disbelief that she'd actually called the media. "Mr. Barrett," the reporter called out, a young woman with dark hair and an eager expression. "I'm Jennifer Cho from Channel 5 News. Can you comment on the allegations that you're violating HOA regulations and building an unpermitted commercial structure?" I stood there in my pajama pants and old t-shirt, coffee mug in hand, trying to process what was happening. "I'm sorry, what?" Deborah stepped forward, addressing the camera rather than me. "Mr. Barrett has been repeatedly asked to comply with community standards and HOA regulations, but he has refused. The Meadowbrook Hills community is concerned about the impact his construction project will have on their property values and quality of life." "That's complete nonsense," I said, finding my voice. "My property isn't part of any HOA. I have legal documentation proving it." Jennifer turned to me, and I could see the story getting more interesting for her. You're claiming you're not part of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. I'm not claiming it. It's a fact. The HOA's boundaries don't extend to my property. There's a county road and several other parcels between my land and the actual Meadowbrook Hills development. That's not true, Deborah interjected. Our boundaries are clearly filed with the county. Then your filing is wrong, I said. My attorney has pulled all the relevant records. This property has been privately owned since the 1980s and has never been part of any homeowners association. Jennifer sensed she'd stumbled into a bigger story than she'd expected. Do you have that documentation available? I can provide it, I said, but I'd like to point out that Miss Henderson brought you here to do a hit piece without getting the other side of the story. This is harassment. The cameraman was capturing everything, and I could see Deborah's confident expression starting to crack. She'd expected me to either cave under the pressure of public scrutiny or come across as an unreasonable troublemaker. Instead, she was the one who looked like she might be lying. Miss Henderson, Jennifer said, turning back to the HOA president, if Mr. Barrett can prove his property isn't part of the HOA, what's your response? I'd have to see this alleged documentation, Deborah said stiffly. I'm confident our records are correct. I'll email everything to the station within the hour, I said. County records, survey maps, property deeds, and the letter from my attorney explaining the legal situation. Jennifer handed me a business card. Please do. We want to make sure we get the facts straight. After they left, I called Patricia and told her what had happened. She was furious on my behalf and immediately sent a comprehensive package to the news station, along with a strongly worded email about Deborah's attempt to manipulate the media. The story that aired that evening was not what Deborah had expected. Jennifer Cho presented both sides fairly, but the documentation was damning. The segment showed the survey maps clearly indicating my property was not within HOA boundaries, included quotes from Patricia about harassment and trespassing, and featured me calmly explaining that I'd done my due diligence before purchasing. Deborah, on the other hand, came across as evasive when pressed about the boundary issue. The segment ended with Jennifer noting that the HOA had not provided any documentation supporting their claim that my property was within their jurisdiction. I thought that might be the end of it. I was wrong again. 2 days later, I arrived at my property to find that someone had vandalized my workshop. Paint had been thrown across the newly installed siding, and several windows I just put in had been smashed. The word comply was spray painted across the front wall in huge red letters. I called the Laramie County Sheriff's Office immediately. Deputy Sarah Ortega arrived within 30 minutes, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She took photos, collected paint samples, and asked detailed questions about my ongoing dispute with the HOA. You think the HOA president did this? She asked. I don't know if she did it personally, but I can't imagine it's a coincidence, I said. She's been escalating her harassment for weeks. Has she made any direct threats? Not explicit ones, but she's made it clear she wants my construction stopped by any means necessary. Deputy Ortega made notes in her report. I'll follow up with Miss Henderson and the other HOA board members. In the meantime, you might want to consider installing some security cameras. Already ordered them, I said. They'll be here tomorrow. The vandalism cost me 3 days of work and about $2,000 in materials that needed to be replaced. I was angry, frustrated, and increasingly convinced that Deborah Henderson was unstable. Patricia suggested we file for a restraining order and pursue a civil lawsuit for the harassment and vandalism. I agreed, and she started preparing the paperwork. The security cameras went up the next day, 4 of them covering all angles of the property. Frank helped me install them, and we made sure they were visible enough to serve as a deterrent but protected enough that they couldn't be easily disabled. "This is getting out of hand," Frank said as we tested the camera feeds on my laptop. "I've seen people get stubborn about HOA stuff before, but never like this." "She's not going to stop until someone forces her to," I said. "I'm hoping the legal action will do it." That night, around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with an alert from the security system. I pulled up the camera feed and saw a figure dressed in dark clothing approaching the workshop with what looked like a can of spray paint. I was out of bed and calling 911 within seconds, throwing on clothes while keeping an eye on the screen. The person was painting something on the wall, their face covered by a hood. I grabbed my keys and headed for my truck, but the dispatcher told me firmly to stay where I was and let the deputies handle it. By the time I got outside, the vandal was gone, having apparently heard the sirens approaching. But the cameras had captured everything in crisp, high-definition video. Deputy Ortega arrived with a partner, and we reviewed the footage together. The video clearly showed the figure's build and movements, and while the face wasn't visible, there were several identifying details. The person wore distinctive white sneakers with pink accents, and at one point, when they raised their arms to paint higher on the wall, a gold bracelet was clearly visible on their wrist. "We'll need to show this to Miss Henderson and the board members," Deputy Ortega said. "See if anyone recognizes the clothing or jewelry." The new graffiti said, "Leave," in the same red spray paint as before. The deputies took additional photos and collected the empty paint the vandal had discarded at the edge of my property. "We might get fingerprints off this," Deputy Ortega's partner, a young guy named Deputy Chen, said, "assuming the perp wasn't wearing gloves." The investigation moved quickly after that. Deputy Ortega showed the video to Deborah Henderson the next day, and according to the deputy, Deborah's reaction was interesting. She'd claimed not to recognize the clothing or jewelry, but she'd been noticeably nervous, kept adjusting her own gold bracelet, and asked to see the video multiple times. Then came the break we needed. Margaret Dunn, the HOA treasurer who'd seemed uncomfortable during that first confrontation at my property, contacted Deputy Ortega and asked to speak with her privately. I found out about it when Patricia called me 2 days later, barely able to contain her excitement. "Margaret Dunn came forward with information," Patricia said. "Apparently, Deborah has been lying to the entire HOA board about your property. She told them you were part of the HOA and refusing to comply, when she actually knew all along that you weren't within their boundaries." Why would she do that? According to Margaret, Deborah has been obsessed with expanding the HOA's territory and control. She sees your property as a threat because if you can build whatever you want out there, it sets a precedent for other property owners in the area to ignore HOA pressure. Margaret also said Deborah has been increasingly erratic at board meetings, making decisions without board approval and using HOA funds inappropriately. "Does Margaret know who vandalized my workshop?" She has suspicions. Deborah has a daughter, Nicole, who's 23 and apparently follows her mother around like a devoted disciple. Margaret saw Nicole wearing a gold charm bracelet identical to the one in your security video. Can they prove it? The deputies are working on it. They're going to request a voluntary interview with Nicole and ask to see her shoes and jewelry. If she refuses, they may pursue a search warrant. Things moved faster after that. Nicole Henderson, it turned out, wasn't nearly as good at hiding her guilt as her mother. When Deputy Ortega and Deputy Chen showed up at the Henderson house to ask some questions, Nicole initially denied everything. But when they showed her the security footage and pointed out the distinctive bracelet and shoes, she broke down and confessed. She'd vandalized my workshop both times, acting on her mother's encouragement. Deborah hadn't explicitly ordered the vandalism, but she'd complained bitterly about my construction project in front of Nicole, making comments about how someone needed to send a message and make him understand he can't just do whatever he wants. Nicole was arrested and charged with criminal mischief and trespassing. Deborah was not directly charged with the vandalism, but the investigation into her conduct as HOA president was just beginning. Margaret Dunn, along with two other board members who'd been kept in the dark about the true nature of the dispute, called for an emergency HOA meeting. They voted to remove Deborah as president, citing misuse of her authority, misrepresentation of facts to the board, and behavior that brought negative attention to the community. Deborah fought it, of course, threatening to sue the board and claiming she was being scapegoated. But when Margaret presented evidence that Deborah had been using HOA funds to pay for her personal legal fees related to the dispute with me, without board approval, the other homeowners turned on her completely. The Channel 5 news story Jennifer Cho ran about the vandalism arrest and Deborah's removal as HOA president was watched by over 100,000 people in the Cheyenne area. It became a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and abuse of power. Patricia filed a civil lawsuit against both Deborah and Nicole Henderson for the damages to my property, harassment, and emotional distress. The case was strong, backed by video evidence, police reports, and testimony from multiple witnesses including Margaret Dunn. Deborah's lawyer tried to argue that she genuinely believed my property was within HOA jurisdiction, and that she'd been acting in what she thought were the community's best interests. But when Patricia presented evidence of emails Deborah had sent to other board members after receiving Patricia's letter clearly stating the property boundaries, emails where Deborah acknowledged the property might not actually be in the HOA, but said they should push forward anyway, that defense crumbled. The case settled out of court 3 months later. The Hendersons agreed to pay $45,000 in damages, legal fees, and punitive costs. Nicole completed a plea deal for the criminal charges, accepting probation and community service in exchange for a guilty plea to reduce charges. By that point, my workshop was finished. It was beautiful, everything I'd hoped for, with high ceilings, excellent lighting, and enough space for all my equipment. I'd started taking commissions for custom furniture, turning my hobby into a legitimate side business that supplemented my income from my day job as a software consultant. Frank and I were sharing a beer on my completed deck, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple, when he raised his bottle in a toast. "To standing your ground," he said. "To good neighbors," I countered, clinking my bottle against his. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA limped along under new leadership. Margaret Dunn took over as interim president and immediately set about repairing the organization's reputation. She sent me a personal letter of apology, along with a confirmation in writing that my property was not, had never been, and would never be claimed as part of their jurisdiction. I appreciated the gesture, though I'd already known I was in the right. Sometimes the principle matters more than the outcome, and I wasn't about to let someone bully me off my own land just because they had a clipboard and an inflated sense of authority. Deborah Henderson moved away 6 months after the settlement. I heard through the grapevine that she'd taken a job in Montana and was trying to rebuild her life away from the community where she'd become infamous. I didn't wish her ill, but I didn't waste much sympathy on her either. She'd brought everything on herself through arrogance and an unwillingness to accept that she might be wrong. Nicole stayed in Cheyenne, and I actually ran into her at the hardware store about a year after the whole ordeal ended. She was buying paint for her apartment, and when she saw me, her face went pale. "Mr. Barrett," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology, a real one, not just what the lawyers made me say in court." I studied her for a moment. She looked different, more mature somehow, with less of that aggressive confidence she'd had when following her mother around. "I'm listening," I said. "I was stupid and I was wrong," she said. "My mom convinced me you were the enemy, that you were trying to destroy our community, and I believed her without questioning it. I should have thought for myself. What I did was criminal and cruel, and I'm genuinely sorry." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I've been in therapy for the past year, working through a lot of stuff about my relationship with my mom and my own choices. My therapist suggested I make direct amends where possible." She looked down at her paint cans. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong, and I've learned from it." I considered her words. She seemed sincere, and I'd never been one to hold grudges longer than necessary. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "It takes guts to face someone you've wronged. For what it's worth, I hope you found a better path." Her eyes got a little watery. "Thank you. That means more than you probably realize." We went our separate ways, and I found myself thinking about how situations like this rarely have simple villains and heroes. Deborah had been wrong, absolutely, but she'd also been so convinced of her own righteousness that she'd dragged her daughter down with her. Nicole had made terrible choices, but she was working to be better. As for me, I got exactly what I wanted. My workshop was producing beautiful furniture that people actually paid good money for. I had 5 acres of Wyoming land with no one telling me what I could or couldn't do with it. And I had good neighbors like Frank, who respected boundaries and understood that sometimes the best community is one where people leave each other alone to live their lives. The whole experience taught me something important about standing up for yourself. Not in an aggressive or confrontational way, but in a firm, documented, legally sound way. Deborah had counted on me backing down, on the pressure and harassment wearing me down until I either joined the HOA or gave up on my property entirely. But I'd done my homework before buying the land. I'd known my rights, kept meticulous records, and been willing to invest in good legal representation. When push came to shove, the facts were on my side, and no amount of bluster or manipulation from an overzealous HOA president could change that. I thought about all the people who might not have had the resources or knowledge to fight back, who might have given in to Deborah's demands just to make the harassment stop. It made me angry on their behalf, and it made me grateful that I'd been in a position to stand firm. The workshop became something of a landmark in the area. People would drive by and point it out as that building that whole HOA mess was about, at least according to Frank. Eventually, though, the story faded into local legend, one of those tales people told about crazy neighbor disputes and HOA overreach. I settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings were for my consulting work, afternoons and weekends for woodworking. I built dining tables, bookshelves, cabinets, and custom pieces that challenged my skills and brought me genuine satisfaction. The workshop that Deborah had tried so hard to stop became the center of my life in Wyoming, a place where I could create something tangible and beautiful with my own hands. Frank remained my closest neighbor and good friend. We'd have dinner together once a week, alternating between my place and his ranch. He taught me about the history of the area, showed me the best fishing spots in the nearby streams, and shared stories about the decades he'd spent working the land. "You know what I respect about how you handled that whole thing," he said one evening over steaks I'd grilled on my deck. "You didn't back down, but you didn't turn it into a personal vendetta either. You just wanted to be left alone to do your own thing, and you stood up for that right." "Deborah made it personal," I said. "I just wanted to build a workshop. That's what I mean. You kept your eye on the goal. A lot of people would have gotten so wrapped up in the fight that they'd forget what they were fighting for in the first place." He had a point. It would have been easy to let anger and frustration consume me, to focus more on defeating Deborah than on completing my project. But I'd managed to keep perspective, to remember that the workshop was the point, not the conflict. The legal settlement money from the Hendersons helped offset the costs of the vandalism repairs and the legal fees, though it didn't cover everything. I considered it a worthwhile investment in my peace of mind. The restraining order that had been part of the settlement meant Deborah couldn't come near my property, and while she'd left the state anyway, knowing that legal protection was in place gave me comfort. Margaret Dunn turned out to be an excellent HOA president. She ran the organization with transparency and fairness, always making sure homeowners understood their rights and responsibilities. She sent me a Christmas card that first year with a note saying she hoped I'd had a peaceful and productive year. I sent one back, thanking her for having the courage to stand up to Deborah and bring the truth to light. The Meadowbrook Hills community itself recovered from the scandal. Property values remained stable, and new families moved into the development without any knowledge of the drama that had preceded them. The HOA focused on actual community concerns like maintaining common areas, organizing social events, and handling legitimate covenant violations within their jurisdiction. As for my workshop, it exceeded every expectation. I took on bigger and more complex projects as my skills improved, including a commissioned piece for a restaurant in Cheyenne that led to more commercial work. The income from my woodworking grew to the point where I could cut back on consulting hours, giving me more time to focus on what I loved. Standing at my workbench one afternoon, planing a piece of black walnut for a custom desk commission, I reflected on how close I'd come to losing all of this. If I'd backed down, if I'd let Deborah intimidate me into abandoning my workshop or joining an HOA I'd never signed up for, I'd be somewhere else right now. Probably still in that cramped Denver apartment, still dreaming about the workshop I'd never built. But I hadn't backed down. I'd stood my ground, armed with facts and legal documentation, and I'd won not because I was stubborn or aggressive, but because I was right. The law was on my side, the facts were on my side, and when everything shook out, that mattered more than Deborah's bluster or the HOA's assumed authority. The wood curled away from the plane in satisfying ribbons, revealing the gorgeous grain underneath. This was what mattered. Creating something real, building the life I wanted, being left alone to pursue my passions on my own property. Simple things, really, but things worth fighting for. Frank stopped by later that evening with fresh trout he'd caught in the creek that ran through his property. We fried them up with potatoes and sat on the deck, watching the stars come out in the vast Wyoming sky. The nearest streetlight was miles away and the darkness was absolute, the stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. "You ever regret moving out here?" Frank asked. "Some people find it too isolated." "Not once," I said. "This is exactly what I wanted. Space, peace, freedom to do my own thing." Deborah wanted that too in her own twisted way, Frank mused. She wanted control over her environment, wanted everything organized and neat according to her vision. Problem was, her vision required controlling everyone else too. "That's the difference between freedom and control," I said. "I wanted freedom for myself. She wanted control over others. And that's why you're sitting here eating trout and she's gone, Frank said, raising his beer. To freedom, I echoed. The months turned into years. My workshop became established, my business grew, and my life in Wyoming settled into a rhythm that felt right. I made friends in the local woodworking community, joined a guild, and started teaching occasional classes for people who wanted to learn the craft. The story of my dispute with Deborah and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA became one I told sometimes at guild meetings or when meeting new people in the area. It was always received with a mixture of disbelief and recognition. Everyone, it seemed, had their own HOA horror story, or knew someone who did. The thing is, I'd explain, HOAs serve a legitimate purpose when they're run properly. If you buy into a development with an HOA, you're agreeing to certain restrictions in exchange for community amenities and maintained property values. That's fine. The problem comes when HOA leadership forgets that their authority comes from voluntary membership, not some divine right to control every property in a 5-mile radius. People would nod, share their own stories of overreach and petty tyranny, and inevitably someone would ask if I ever heard from Deborah Henderson again. Not directly, I'd say. But I heard she tried to start another HOA in Montana and got pushback from her neighbors there. Some people never learn. The truth was, I didn't spend much time thinking about Deborah anymore. She'd been a temporary obstacle, a challenge to overcome, but not someone worth dwelling on once the situation was resolved. My energy was better spent on positive things like perfecting my dovetail joints or figuring out how to work with more exotic wood species. One afternoon in my 3rd year on the property, a young couple drove up to my workshop. They introduced themselves as potential buyers of a parcel 3 properties down from mine, on the opposite side from Frank's ranch. We heard about your situation with the HOA, the woman, whose name was Emily, said. We wanted to ask you about it before we commit to buying. Is the HOA still causing problems for people out here? I assured them that the issues had been resolved, that the current HOA leadership under Margaret Dunn was reasonable and respectful of property boundaries, and that they had nothing to worry about as long as they, like me, ensured their property wasn't actually within HOA jurisdiction. The key is doing your due diligence, I said. Get a survey, check the county records, make sure you understand exactly what you're buying and what restrictions, if any, apply to the property. Don't just take someone's word for it. They thanked me and bought the property a month later. I gained new neighbors who turned out to be excellent people, and they never had a single problem with the HOA because they'd followed my advice and confirmed their independence from it before signing any papers. The incident with Deborah Henderson taught me the value of preparation and documentation. It taught me that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's exhausting and frustrating. And it taught me that bullies, whether they're playground thugs or HOA presidents with clipboards, usually back down when confronted with facts and consequences. But most importantly, it taught me that the life you want is worth protecting. That workshop I'd dreamed about for years, that space where I could create and build and work with my hands, it wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of autonomy and independence, of the right to pursue happiness on your own terms. Every time I walk into that workshop now, every time I flip on the lights and see my tools hanging on the walls and smell the sawdust and wood oil, I remember why I fought so hard. Not because I'm stubborn or contrary, but because some things are worth standing up for. The workshop stands as a testament to that principle. It's not just a building anymore. It's proof that you can win against unreasonable authority if you're armed with facts, good legal advice, and the determination to see things through to the end. And every piece of furniture I build there, every custom commission I complete, every student I teach, carries a little bit of that story with it. The story of standing your ground, knowing your rights, and refusing to let anyone push you around just because they think they have the authority to do so. Deborah Henderson demanded I stop building. She claimed my property was under HOA jurisdiction. She was wrong on both counts, and my completed workshop stands as permanent evidence of that fact. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply living well, building what you want to build, and proving that bullies don't always win. The workshop is here, I'm here, and life is exactly what I wanted it to be. That's victory enough for anyone.